One day it was the loudest, brightest place in a child's universe. And then, almost unbelievably, it became a graveyard of empty shelves, liquidation signs, and one haunting image the internet could not forget. Geoffrey the Giraffe, standing alone with a suitcase as if even he had been told it was time to leave. For millions of Americans, Toys R Us did not feel like a store. It felt like childhood itself, which is why its collapse felt so strange, so sudden, and so impossible. How does a company that once seemed too big, too beloved, too deeply woven into American life just disappear? That's the mystery of Toys R Us, the toy empire that made itself feel immortal, only to fall apart in full view of the very families who grew up believing it would always be there. If you grew up in America in the 1980s, 1990s, or even the early 2000s, you probably remember the feeling before you remember the facts. Automatic doors opening, fluorescent lights bouncing off giant white tile floors, endless aisles that seemed taller than you, wider than your imagination, stacked with dolls, bikes, Nerf blasters, racetracks, action figures, and the latest thing every kid in school was talking about. Toys R Us was not just where you bought toys. It was where you discovered them. It was where birthdays began, where Christmas lists were built, where parents wandered in with a plan and children instantly forgot it. And hovering over it all was Geoffrey, the gentle giraffe mascot, who made the place feel less like retail and more like an invitation into a world designed entirely for wonder. Even the jingle became part of American memory. "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," was introduced in 1982 and became one of the most recognizable retail slogans in the country, almost a national anthem for childhood. What made the story even more powerful is that Toys R Us was born from a very simple human observation. In 1948, a young entrepreneur named Charles Lazarus opened a Washington, D.C. store called Children's Bargain Town. He originally focused on baby furniture and items for new parents. But Lazarus noticed something important. Families did not keep returning for another crib or another high chair. They bought those once. Toys were different. Toys brought people back. Toys created repetition, excitement, and emotion. So he slowly shifted his inventory toward the one thing children always wanted more of. Then he had an idea that changed retail history. Instead of a small neighborhood toy shop with limited stock, what if there were a giant supermarket-sized store filled with what felt like every toy in existence? In 1957, he rebranded as Toys R Us and effectively created the first big-box toy store, capturing the post-war boom, the rise of suburbia, and a new American appetite for abundance. That timing was everything. America was in the middle of the baby boom. Families were growing. Suburbs were spreading. Highways were connecting newly built communities to giant shopping centers. And in that moment, Toys R Us became more than a retailer. It became a phenomenon. Other toy stores felt cramped and seasonal, often small family-run businesses that came alive around Christmas and faded into the background the rest of the year. Toys R Us did the opposite. It turned toy shopping into a year-round destination. It was bigger, louder, fuller, and more overwhelming than anything that had come before it. It didn't just compete with other toy stores. It erased them. Historians of retail have described Toys R Us as a category killer, a business so dominant within its niche that it swallowed the market around it. By 2017, decades after its creation, it still accounted for roughly 1/5 of toy sales in the United States. That is how large its shadow was. Entire generations grew up assuming that if a toy existed, it would be somewhere inside those aisles. And that was the secret magic of the place. It was never only about buying. It was about scale. A department store might have had a toy section. A supermarket might have had a toy aisle. But Toys R Us felt like a cathedral built for play. You could walk past an entire wall of Barbie, then turn into a universe of Lego, then see bicycles hanging overhead like trophies, then stumble into video games, plush animals, board games, baby dolls, chemistry kits, and things you did not even know existed until that moment. Parents tolerated it because it solved a practical problem. Kids loved it because it made possibility feel physical. In an era before algorithms knew your desires before you did, Toys R Us let children wander into discovery. It was one of the few places in American retail that seemed to belong unapologetically to kids. Shoppers interviewed during the company's final days described it as the one store where children could actually see toys, touch toys, and feel like the place was meant for them, not merely attached to another shopping trip. But empires rarely collapse in a single dramatic instant. Usually they begin by making one decision that seems reasonable at the time. For Toys R Us, one of those moments came with the internet. In the late 1990s, e-commerce was still new, chaotic, and full of promise. The company's own website suffered during the 1999 holiday season, with some customers receiving gifts after Christmas. That embarrassment pushed Toys R Us into a major partnership with Amazon in 2000. On paper, it looked smart. Amazon would handle the digital machinery. Toys R Us would provide the toys. The partnership was supposed to bring the iconic toy retailer safely into the online future. Instead, it became an omen. Toys R Us later argued that Amazon violated the deal by allowing other toy sellers onto the platform. A long legal battle followed, and in 2009, Amazon agreed to pay Toys R Us $51 million to settle the dispute. The settlement was real, but the deeper damage was harder to measure. At the exact moment the future of retail was being rewritten, Toys R Us had outsourced too much of its online destiny and lost precious time trying to catch up. Still, even that did not kill the company. The fatal wound came from somewhere less visible to most customers and far more destructive. In 2005, Toys R Us was taken private in a $6.6 billion leveraged buyout by Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado Realty Trust. To ordinary shoppers, nothing seemed to change overnight. Stores still opened. Geoffrey still smiled. Birthdays and holidays still arrived. But beneath the surface, the company had been loaded with a mountain of debt. Years later, that burden would become almost impossible to escape. Reuters reported that Toys R Us was paying around $400 million a year just in interest. CNN reported that when the company filed for bankruptcy in 2017, it still had about $5 billion in debt. Think about that for a second. Hundreds of millions of dollars that could have gone into renovating stores, improving technology, training staff, lowering prices, or reinventing the shopping experience were instead being burned just to service old financial obligations. To customers, the brand still looked famous. To the balance sheet, it was already gasping for air. And this is where the story turns from nostalgic to tragic. Because while Toys R Us was sending money to creditors, the world around it was changing fast. Walmart and Target became more aggressive in toys, using them as traffic-driving products inside broader shopping ecosystems. Amazon became faster, cheaper, and more convenient. Meanwhile, Toys R Us stores began to feel stuck in time. Even the company's own leadership admitted it had fallen behind in upkeep and store condition. The irony was cruel. The chain that once felt magical to children now felt to many parents like a giant, aging warehouse. Consultants described the environment as cold and difficult to navigate, especially for a category that depended on delight and discovery. Employees were stretched thin. Investments came too late. Plans for better play areas, demonstrations, and more engaging spaces were discussed during bankruptcy, but the money and the time were both running out. A store built on wonder had slowly become a place many shoppers no longer found exciting. Then came the pressure from forces no single retailer could fully control. Shopping habits changed. Millennial parents, raised on the internet, approached buying differently from the generation before them. Foot traffic fell across brick-and-mortar retail. Children's lives became more scheduled, more screen-based, more fragmented, and toys themselves faced a new kind of competition. Not just other toys, but apps, streaming, gaming, and the endless pull of digital entertainment. On top of that, the toy business was brutally seasonal. A massive portion of annual sales happened during the holidays. If Christmas went poorly, the year could collapse with it. By 2017, Toys R Us was caught in a perfect storm. Too much debt, too little flexibility, rising competition from Walmart, Target, and Amazon, social changes in how families shopped and how children played, and disappointing holiday performance at the exact moment it could least afford failure. From the outside, it looked like the chain had suddenly stumbled. In reality, the floor beneath it had been weakening for years. When Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September 2017, there was still hope. The company said stores would remain open. It secured financing. Executives tried to reassure suppliers and shoppers that this was a restructuring, not a funeral. But bankruptcy has a way of changing how people behave. Vendors grew nervous and began curbing shipments because they feared they might not be repaid. That was devastating for a retailer heading into the holiday season, the one time of year it most needed full shelves and confidence from its partners. Behind the scenes, advisors had already spent months trying to fix the capital structure and avoid this moment. But the options were running out. By March 2018, the truth became impossible to hide. Toys R Us would sell or close all of its U.S. stores. More than 30,000 employees were caught in the collapse. For customers, the end arrived not as a dramatic final announcement but as a slow-motion funeral. Yellow signs, half-empty aisles, gift cards clutched nervously in line. Children too young to understand why the toy store suddenly looked sad. What made the fall so haunting was that it exposed how much more Toys R Us had been than a business. Its disappearance left a hole in the culture. Analysts worried not only about families and workers, but about smaller toy companies that had relied on the chain as a place where shoppers could discover new products outside the orbit of retail giants. Without Toys R Us, much of that business was expected to flow to larger players, leaving less room for surprise, less room for wandering, less room for a child to see something strange and wonderful on a shelf and beg for it on instinct. That is part of what people were mourning. Not just a chain, but a kind of experience. A slower, more tactile, more enchanted way of shopping. A place where childhood had physical space. In the end, Toys R Us did not vanish because children stopped loving toys. It vanished because the financial structure broke, the stores aged, the strategy faltered, and the world moved faster than the company could heal. And yet, like many ghosts of American retail, it never disappeared completely. The brand lingered. Lenders canceled plans to simply let the name die. Later, the Toys R Us brand changed hands again, and in 2021, WHP Global acquired it. By 2022, Macy's was opening Toys R Us shop-in-shops across every Macy's store in America, complete with colorful fixtures, demonstration tables, and even Geoffrey photo opportunities. The name survived. The mascot survived. In some parts of the world, the brand still lives on. But what returned was not the same empire that once stood alone at the center of childhood. The original Toys R Us was a product of a different America. Post-war optimism, suburban sprawl, giant stores, weekend family outings, and a time when walking through aisles could feel like entering another world. Its rise was magical. Its fall was financial. And its legacy is a warning hidden inside a memory. Even the most beloved places can disappear when the numbers underneath the dream stop making sense. That may be the most unsettling part of all. For a generation of kids, Toys R Us promised they never had to grow up, but in the end, the store did, and it couldn't survive it.